I just watched the top 50 action movies from the last 20 years. That is over 100 hours of explosions, car chases, and bad one-liners. And while I was watching them, I started taking data points. I wanted to see if I could predict exactly who the villain would be, just by looking at the year the movie came out. And it turns out I could. But why? Is it random? Or is it just what sells? To answer that, we have to look at the engineering of society. Today we're going to break down the three mechanisms that power Hollywood. We are going to look at radical formation, systemic racism, and intersectionality. Okay, first, let's take a look at the bad guys, right? In the 80s, they were always Russian. In the 2000s, they're always Middle Eastern. Today, we see a lot of cyber terrorism or faceless corporation. This shift is explained by the concept of radical formation. Right? Now, the socialists, Omni, and Wiante, sorry if I butchered the name, define this as the social process by which radical categories are created, inhabited, and transformed, and destroyed. I like that quote a lot because think of race as a blueprint that keeps getting redrawn. It's not biological, it's category that society builds based on what is happening in the world, right? So you kind of have to think of it that way, like, why did it do that? You gotta think of kind of the time and events. Russians were always seen as the bad guys in the 80s. In the 2000s, Middle Eastern became such a big problem when, for example, 9/11 happened. That was a key time of when racism started to change. It shifted away from more of the Russian side to the Middle Eastern side based off of the current time events. Now we see more in the news of the cyber terrorism or the faceless corporations. And that's a lot different. It's like the cancel cultures of the world or hackers that are breaking in, scammers from India and stuff like that, you know? This is all a new generation of radical formation. When the Cold War ended, the Russian villain blueprint didn't work anymore. So Hollywood and society transformed the category. They created a new enemy. So when you watch these movies, you aren't just seeing a story, you are seeing a snapshot of ultimately how society was building a racial category. At that exact moment in time. And every time you look at it and watch it, it changed. For example, that's why you don't see a lot of Western movies, because in the Western times, the enemy was typically Indians, for example. That was a point that I saw when I was reviewing all these movies. But here, the question is, if we knew these stereotypes were happening, or we knew of them, right? Why do we keep making them, right? Why hasn't the algorithm changed? That brings us to the next engineering running the whole thing. Systemic racism, right? I have no idea how to say his name. Joe Fegan, a leading expert on this, defines it as the unjust institutionalized ongoing reproduction of white, wealthy, and power the construct improves of people of color. I'd probably butcher that like crazy. but you can probably see on the screen what it is. A lot of people think racism is just one glitchy robot, right? One bad person being mean. But Fegan says it's the whole operating system, right? It's like if you have a bad phone, one app could be the virus, right? That still makes it a bad phone. That virus can make everything worse. That's kind of how I'm looking at it. Looking at the credits of those 50 movies I watched. Who funded them? Who wrote them? Who directed them? You can kind of see, like, piece by piece of, like, if the system has been the same group of people for 100 years, the output is going to protect their worldview. The system reproduces the same power. The same power. That is why heroes usually look like the people running the studio, and the villains look like, well, everybody else, right? It's not a glitch. It's a feature of a system. Or not a system, the system. It's quite complex, and if you take a deeper look at it, you can actively see why it's continuing. And you can see, if you look back at all the movies, the top movies, I searched from IMDb and Letterboxd and stuff like that, right? Netflix, all these ones, you will see that timeline. And these same directors, these major directors, feeding the system, feeding the agenda. Alright, we're almost done. Okay, last experiment. We've looked at the villains, right? Now let's take a look at their sidekicks. Let's focus on specifically the women in these movies. I noticed that the women, right? The women of color in these action movies almost never get to be just the hero, right? They're usually the exotic spy or person in distress, right? To understand this, we need to look at a tool called intersectionality. Okay, this was coined by Kimberly Kenshaw, right? And she called it a prism from seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other, right? Let's see. If you just look at racism, right? You're missing like a bunch of things. It's not just racism. You're getting like at least at max half the picture, right? If you look at sexism, you miss the other half of that equation. When a black woman is casted in an action movie, she's hit by both beams of light at the same time. These. Let me redo that one. When a black woman is casted in an action movie, she is hit by both beams of light at the same time. The movie trophies rely on her race and her gender to create a specific stereotype, right? You can't separate them. They intersect. Just rewatch it and focus more on that level of detail for them. You will see, and I'll put up some examples of just like a few of them that are like this. Okay, and just take a look at their roles, their dialogue, their script time, their how they perform in the movies, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do, and if it also helps too, look up behind the scenes. That also is a major form, comparing from even if we go back to what we were first talking about, the 80s through the 2000s, right? From those from the 50 movies that I've watched, right? And you go through the timeline, you can see how each type of person was treated. And just pay attention to race, the sexual orientation, and the time of when this film took place. And not when it was released, when it was starting to film, and when it finished film. Look at how they were treated. Look at the little details. Look for any news about it, right? Because often back then, this equality and stuff like that, racism, were still also a huge thing back in the day. But sometimes they weren't always seen, right? Alright, so what did we learn from this movie marathon? For me at least, I learned that movies are not just popcorn and fun, right? They're data. They show us radical formation happening in real time. They show us systemic racism that keeps the same story on repeat and going and going and going. They show us intersectionality that creates specific traps for characters based on who they are. Not as the character, but as the person that they are. The good news. Once you see the code, you can't unsee it. And that is the first step in rewriting the script. As a film creator myself, and as a director, as a editor, as a actor, as a VFX expert, as all these titles that I've had, photographer, now you can see it. This is something that a lot of creators of entertainment do see, but they don't point it out. Alright. Thank you guys for watching. I'm gonna go take a nap. See ya.